Jai Hind and welcome to Dev Talks on News That Matters, Episode 2. We'll talk about the war in Ukraine. We'll talk about the EU oil sanctions that are taking place. We'll talk about the narrative war. We'll talk about the latest developments that are taking place on the ground, as well as we'll talk about China and Pakistan. And of course, we'll touch upon a little bit towards the Indian neighborhood. Let's start with the war update. As we all know, the war is chugging along in the region of Donbas, in the basically sub-regions of the Donetsk and Luhansk areas. The major place where the battle is happening is around a river in two cities or two towns known as Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. Now, what has happened is, in terms of the operations that the Russians has conducted in the past few days in that area, it has resulted in the encirclement of the Ukrainian troops within that space. In such a scenario, any normal army would give orders to its army to withdraw from that location to prevent them from getting completely surrounded, surrender, or destroyed. We don't see that happening with the Ukraine. We see orders to stand and fight. When something like that happens, we've seen certain reports coming out from various different sources, as a matter of fact, Ukrainian and Russian sources, which are showing today that some small units within the Ukrainian army are refusing to fight, knowing very well what stands for them in that particular area. The justification behind the stand to fight orders is something that I am not able to understand what the logic behind losing perfectly good units and equipment in a lost battle. I don't I'm not able to figure out what the logic behind is. As a matter of fact, President Zelensky actually visited a city called Kharkiv, which is in the northeast part of Ukraine. This is just a couple of days ago. It was probably an exercise which they themselves say is for the boosting of morale of their troops fighting on the ground. Remember, Kharkiv is a place which came into news a couple of weeks ago for the counteroffensives that the Ukrainians had claimed to have taken, where they pushed the Russian forces back to the Russian border. Well, the counteroffensives, of course, failed, and the Russians are back into what they were. And today there are reports of shelling happening in Kharkiv. That tells you that the Russians are at about artillery range from the city. Leaving that apart, couple of things that came out from a talk that he had done to a couple of reporters talks about the factor that he understands that negotiations are the only way forward for Ukraine. Having said that, the reporter was quick enough of asking him about these counteroffensives that the Ukrainians have been taking against the Russian forces in various different regions. I'll talk about the counteroffensives in a minute, but let's just talk about what reply that President Zelensky gave to the reporter. Well, what he spoke about was that he is perfectly aware that Ukraine would not be able to take back the territories that they have lost to Russia by creating a counteroffensive, because he understands it will mean the loss of thousands and thousands of men. Having said that, the logic behind this entire counteroffensive drama, if I may put it that way, is that the Ukrainians want to have a stronger position while negotiations, which inevitably will have to happen between Ukraine and Russia. Now, that to me is a little weird, because who is going to throw thousands and thousands of troops into counteroffensives or into small little penny packet operations to gain a few pieces of land here and there to gain an upper hand on the negotiating table? I wonder if that makes military sense. And I'm not sure about it. I'm not a military person, but this is what my logic tells me. Another interesting thing that happened in Kharkiv was that the Azov battalion, the supposedly neo-Nazi right-wing battalion of the Ukrainian Ministry of Interior, or as known as the Home Guards, was rebranded. Now that is interesting, because one thought that the large part of this far-right battalion was destroyed in Mariupol during the surrender of Azovstal. We all know there were penny packets of these guys hanging around Kiev and many other cities, and they were even fighting in Donbas. But to collect a bunch of soldiers and actually rebrand them by changing their insignia, which they used to wear, to the armed forces of Ukraine trident, which we can see all around the place. The question that I'd like to ask is that the insignia is okay. What are the Ukrainians planning to do about the horrific tattoos that we've seen on these guys? Ukraine does have a far right problem, and this is something that has been recorded by many a Western news publications. There have been documentaries made on it multiple times. You can check Vice, you can check many other places where you will find enough evidence of far right groups within Ukraine. As a matter of fact, the US Congress at one time was concerned about the activities of this particular group, the Azov Battalion. Talking about the US has finally decided to send in their high mobility M142 rocket systems to the Ukrainians. The fear was that these systems could fire up to a range of about 300 kilometers, and the US and the Ukrainians were under negotiations where the US wanted the Ukrainians to promise that these systems would not be fired against Russia in Russian territory. Now, that is interesting. If they call this a war, why won't you want to target someone else? That is because the USA also knows that providing such systems to the Ukraine may just escalate the situation and may just escalate the tensions and the situation in that region, leading to a larger war. The current systems that are being given to the Ukraine are having a range of about 70 kilometers, and at a precursory study, don't seem to be that much different from the systems that the Ukrainians had at the beginning of the war. Question I'd like to ask here is that are these weapons being given to Ukraine just to keep that little fire burning? Because one is unaware of the strategic impact that these weapons would make on the battlefield, apart from creating few further delays. And we all can see how this war has been dragging on and on. USA, as a matter of fact, the USA Cyber Command yesterday put out a statement that USA has been involved in offensive cyber operations against Russia. I've discussed this in one of my interviews with, Lieutenant General Panwar, that what is the red line to war in terms of cyber operations? Since that has not been defined, I think the USA is taking advantage of that particular situation. Rightly so. It's an opposition to Russians, and they are taking their whatever they need to do. Let's talk about these counteroffensives that I mentioned a little while ago. The Ukrainians have had a total of 3 counteroffensives that they've taken place, which are highly publicized. The first one was on the so-called Snake Island just before the 9th of May. I believe it was done for a PR victory to spoil the Russian Victory Day celebrations. The second one was done in May, early part of May, in the region of Kharkiv, as I mentioned, where we saw a couple of Ukrainian soldiers trotting around with a border post and running to some jungle somewhere, clicking a photograph and publicizing that they've gone up to the Russian border. Today, when we look at the map being released by both Ukraine and Russia, we see that the Ukrainian forces have been pushed back and the Russians are back in the places where they were before this counteroffensive started. The third counteroffensive has just taken place recently, about a week ago, in a city or a region called Kherson. A lot was spoken about this, a lot has been mentioned about it from both the sides. If we were to believe the Ukrainian side, it talks about the counteroffensive being able to penetrate the Russian defense lines and being able to cause significant amount of damage to the Russian forces in that region. But when we talk about the Russian side, they talk about losses of over 200 Ukrainian military personnel, apart from about 20 odd armored personnel carriers or armored vehicles or tanks of that vehicles of that particular nature. And we see the map which is being put out by both the places. When you compare it, we realize that the lines that were breached by the Ukrainian forces have been straightened out, have been strengthened again, and we hear of Russians conducting artillery strikes into the headquarters where this strike was planned. This particular thing was reported by Ukraine as well, and supposedly, and I'm going to say that because I don't have any way of confirming it, the Russians claim that they've been able to do a significant amount of damage to the command and control systems in a city called Mykolaiv, very close to Kherson. The European Union, a couple of days ago, came up with their oil ban, sixth round of sanctions against Russia, where they have come up with a plan to stop oil imports from sea. The pipelines, although at this moment would continue. How far an effective situation that is something that we will see in the coming times. Now, the irony of this whole situation, when I look at it, is twofold. One, the Europeans are looking at literally cutting down their own economy to spite Russia. How far they will be successful with this, how far their economies will be able to take the brunt, and how far would the people of the European Union accept this kind of stuff is something that we'll have to see. The second part that I'd like to talk about, that this particular oil ban, when it was being discussed amongst the European Union Commission and the various different countries and their ambassadors, Hungary, Croatia, and a couple of other countries were not very happy with it, especially Hungary, because it being a landlocked nation and it cannot source oil from anywhere else. It needs to depend on the countries which are next to it, providing him the port facilities. So, as a matter of fact, the Hungarian Prime Minister had put up a proposal that they would stop sea imports of Russian oil but continue the pipeline. At that time, when he had proposed this, he was shot down, and a lot of criticism came out for Prime Minister Orban of Hungary. Now that this deal is done, Hungary finds itself safe with the pipeline oil coming into it. And I'm sure a lot of the European countries which are going to fall short of their oil supplies are going to run to Hungary and buy oil from them. Irony died 1,000 deaths when I tried to understand this. Because here is a country that opposed the sanctions, is getting the best deal post the sanctions have been implemented. How they have come up with this particular plan is something which is beside me. A lot of the European countries talk about sourcing oil from other places. For anybody who does a precursory study of crude oil and refinement of refineries that use crude oil for their work, they would realize that crude oil can be refined only in specifically tuned refineries. Let me explain. Russian oil can be refined in refineries that are tuned to Russian oil. There is no switch that you switch on and off saying that today I'm processing Russian oil, tomorrow I'm processing Saudi oil, and day after I'm processing American oil. It doesn't work like that. Oil is not that easy a game to play with. And I think the countries need to understand this very, very clearly. Oil will sell. And on that note, I think we all know that the Russian oil exports have pretty much come to its pre-war level. India, on one hand, is buying huge amount of oil from Russia. China is buying a lot of oil from Russia. And of course, I'm sure a few other countries are also doing so. The backfire of this whole narrative about oil ban is resulting in a Eurozone inflation of about 9%, which is pretty much the highest that that area is seen after the formation of the European Union. How these leaders are going to go back and explain to their own populations is something that I don't understand. You know, one very interesting thing that the Wall Street Journal had reported about a month ago, if I'm not mistaken, about 15, 20 days or a month ago, was that oil from Russian ports was increasingly being shipped in tankers where the destination of the oil was not being marked. By the end of April, as per this article, about 11.1 million barrels were loaded into tankers without a pre-planned route. Where this oil is going is something that we'll never know. But let me tell you one thing, doing a little research, one has realized that there are various ways to wash this oil in the middle of the sea, change the ownership, and bring it back to a particular destination, covering the fact that it is Russian oil. How much of that is happening is something I can't confirm, but this does happen. I'd like to actually take a moment and talk about the shift in narrative which is now taking place. In one of my interviews, I had mentioned that the New York Times had published an article talking about the need for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. The Washington Post had come out and put in an article about the very bad condition of Ukrainian soldiers and desertion amongst Ukrainian troops. Uh, you can search these articles, they're there online, uh, from the Donbas region. The Guardian wrote an article sometime back, the Telegraph wrote an article sometime back. What one sees is a shift of narrative. And that is very interesting because these were the very publications that came out and gave all sorts of ridiculous stories about what is happening in the war and the battles that were not being fought but won by the Ukrainians. It really wonders me whether these media narratives have edged the Ukrainians to keep on continuing and fighting this war. Because one of the biggest drawbacks of propaganda is that sometimes the propagandist himself starts believing his own stories. As they say, tell a lie 100 times and you'll think that it's the truth. One very interesting thing that came out some time back is that the MI6 of England, mind you, had come out and said that Putin is dead. Now, all I have to say for something like this, you've given him cancer, you've given him, I don't know what all. Now you've killed him. I hope this will end this kind of speculation which goes on across about world leaders, because it is embarrassing, if nothing else. I'd like to read to you from a small statement that former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had given about the war in Ukraine. And he says, if the Ukrainian leader, that is President Zelensky, had promised Russia not to join NATO, not to allow the alliance to deploy its troops near the Russian borders, today's events could have been avoided. Former Prime Minister Abe emphasized that President Zelensky could have granted autonomy to the DPR, that's the Donetsk People's Republic, and the LPR, that's the Luhansk People's Republic, but instead he chose conflict. Something very, very interesting. As a matter of fact, I've done a video on the information war with Lieutenant General Shaukin Chauhan, where I try and see whether the Russians have actually lost the war of narrative. Because to all of us, the war of narrative and the war information war, as per se, happens on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, and probably on Telegram. Let me break that bubble a little bit. Information war does happen on all those platforms, which is known as general propaganda. But as a matter of fact, there is a whole new section of information warfare that takes place on the battlefield itself. And in my opinion, in whatever study I've done till now, the Russians are winning that particular battle of information. Let's move on from the Eastern Europe, where a lot is happening with affecting all of our lives. Petrol prices are going up, although not in India currently, because we're buying a ton of Russian oil at cheap prices. But I don't know how long will we be able to last that. Let's wait and watch, and let's hope the supplies continue. China, actually, if you remember, I've done a video with General Shankar about the Quad and the after effects. China had launched this whole Indo-Pacific security sort of a setting where they wanted to approach 11 island nations. I've discussed this in the episode 1, where I tell you that there was some sort of resistance within those countries. All 11, mind you, have rejected Chinese efforts. Shanghai ends its lockdown on the 1st, but the policies that have been put in place by the local authorities are very severe. For example, if in a building one person tests positive, the entire building shall be locked down. One of the implications of the Shanghai industrial complex and everything opening up is the increase in oil prices. I wonder how many of you know that the Brent has shot up to $117 a barrel. That is because as the demand increases, the supply remains the same and the price goes up. The Philippine president says that he will assert strongly the claims of Philippines in the South China Sea. This at the backdrop of some amount of harassment that the Philippines have had to face with regards to fishing. Now, the news about the Chinese, and I'll be releasing a video which I've done with Commodore Anil Jai Singh with regards to the Indian aircraft carrier. Why do I mention the Indian aircraft carrier suddenly? is because rumor has it that the Chinese will be launching the third carrier within the next 1 or 2, 3 days. The 003. I'm not sure what name would be kept, but that's what is going to happen. Apart from that, one of the most interesting things in terms of the politics we see in China is that the pretty much ousted premier of China, Li Keqiang, is back in the limelight with his economic boost plan, some 33 points that he had suggested. And there is a whole lot of talk about what is going to happen with regards to the economy in China. One of the things that I'd like to point out here is that these subtle signs that you see within China are quite an indication, not at the face value, but one has to observe and see what really happens. As far as India, China is concerned, India is, China used to be India's #1 trade partner, had a trade of about 115, 110, $115 billion. But now the US has taken over that place and has come to a bilateral trade between both the countries of about $119.78 billion, if I'm not mistaken. The Chinese, as a matter of fact, have been very upset with this entire thing, and the foreign ministry spokesperson day or so ago had come out and said, the calculation is not right, and we are trading with India at 125 billion, and this is not the way that good trade partners should be talking about each other. Well, it's all this is normally expected from China. Let's talk about the Indian subcontinent before we go into our very friendly neighbor of Pakistan. By the way, one more news that I'd like to mention about China. There was a news about yesterday wherein the core commanders are going to have another round of an LAC talk. I think it's the 15th one this time, 15th or 16th one this time. And, we've not had much of a sort of a breakthrough within these talks since the last time of the Pengong So and the Hot Springs talks. Let's hope something comes out, although I won't bet my money onto it. So, as I said, moving on to the Indian subcontinent, we've got the Sri Lankan crisis, which chugs along. The Sri Lankan, ministers were there in India who met for our finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman, asking for certain help and assistance which the Sri Lankans need. One of the another interesting things that we see is that the Prime Minister, Ranil Wickremesinghe, has also be the finance minister. It doesn't sound that weird, but one must know that nobody in the country wants to take up the job of the finance minister. What is going to happen to this country is something that we'll have to wait and watch. Nepal, the new Prime Minister Debua has raked up the issue of the border with India once again. I wonder if this is a vote-gaining sort of a game within Nepal, that every time they're into some trouble, they try and point a finger towards India. It's a little bit of a popularist move. And this is on the backdrop of his visit to India some time ago, where he went to Kashi, did some prayers, and talked about similar cultures and the big brother and this and that and everything. And now this comes out. India has its challenges within its neighborhood. But as far as Nepal is concerned, they need to look at their north, where Chinese are slow and steady nibbling their country. Pakistan, very, very important. Huge amount of fracas took place with regards to that whole Jalsa long march from Imran Khan. There seems to be some sort of